Alright, in this video we'll continue talking about our soil fertility and soil organic matter. So first of all, what is organic matter, or what are some sources of organic matter? We have our living biomass, that's both plant and microbial. Plant litter and residues dissolve organics in soil solutions, and highly complex, no longer identifiable material uh, is our humus. So the top three I've broken up into our labile carbon. This is readily available for decomposition, think like a 2 to 10 year time frame. And then humus is much more complex, harder to break down, sort of on a multi-decade time frame. So this is a pie chart of total organic matter. And so we have our um, labile, or another term for it would be particulate organic matter, in our fresh residues and living organisms. So this makes up about 20% of our total organic matter. Largest portion is the humus, in the 65% fraction here, and then about 15% is resistant organic matter or recalcitrant organic matter, and this is even takes even longer to decompose. And so this 15 plus 65, this 80% of our total organic matter is much harder to decompose, which is why we need a constant input of this labile organic matter to drive plant nutrients and soil health. So one amendment that gets added would be black carbon. So this can be like the terra preta soils in the Amazon, or a biochar amendment. So this is organic matter that is burned in a low oxygen environment. This is called pyrolysis, and it creates black carbon, which has this really high surface area, which equals an increase in cation exchange capacity, so the ability to hold essential elements for plants. And it's also very stable, so it should last in the soil for decades, possibly even centuries. Then the last note there, biochar factor fiction. There's a lot of research coming out or been done in the last decade or so on biochar soil amendments. One of the biggest influences are the material that has been charred, as well as anything else that they might be putting in that mix. And we'll talk a little bit about this in the soil amendment video. Organic matter for plant growth, so organic compounds absorbed by plants. Organic matter is a good source of nitrogen and phosphorus and other acids and hormones that plants need, as well as fulvic and humic substances. So these can increase availability of micronutrients. They may also mimic plant growth hormones, and as well as have an influence on the microbial communities in the soil. In human regions, humic substances sustain plant growth. You remember in like warm, humid regions, there's just this constant turnover of organic matter, and the soils themselves are actually fairly leached and nutrient poor, but this cycling of organic matter is what drives new plant growth. And then, using these humic soil amendments, there's some mixed scientific results. Again, I think it's an issue of knowing your source of the humic substance and what you're trying to do with its application. Organic matter's input on plant growth, so we need to talk about allelopathy. So this is when one plant can influence the growth of another through exudates, whether that's through roots or possibly foliage decomposition. This can work to function as signal chemicals. In agriculture, one study of this is the impact of weeds on crop damage. So crops growing without weeds have higher yields than crops growing in the presence of weeds, even when held constant for water and nutrient availability. There's just something about certain weeds being next to certain crops that reduces that crop growth. Urban trees or forests, you might be thinking of jungleland species and the effect of that gibberellic acid, or not gibberellic, juglans on other plants growing beneath that canopy. But it's not all bad. There are positive effects that have been noticed with companion planting, so two plants that grow better when planted together than when planted separately. Organic matter's effect on soil properties, so on physical properties, it affects the color. We have darker color, structure, better, stronger structure, and granulation. Organic matter added to clays can help reduce the cohesion and stickiness and improve soil structure, as well as increasing plant available water by both increasing the filtration and the water holding capacity of the soil. Then I have this little note to remind me to mention that the increase in plant available water is higher when we add organic matter to sand than to clay. So if we add 5% organic matter to sand, we're going to store a lot more water comparatively than if we just added that 5% of organic matter to clay, just due to the particle size of the clay and its already high uh, water holding capacity. Organic matter's influence on chemical soil properties. So humus works as a cation absorption sponge due to its high surface area, holds onto these cations and reduces leaching. Can also increase the buffer capacity, increase soil ability to buffer changes in pH. And the decomposition can be a nice, slow, steady source of plant nutrients. Organic matter can also help chelate these essential elements, and you may have seen, chelated soil amendments. What this means is it's sort of a mix that helps keep that cation in a state that is plant available. And so when talking about the nitrogen cycle, a lot of times that nitrogen might be present, but it's not in a plant available form. But chelated amendments sort of help to maintain that plant availability. Biologically, organic matter provides most of the food for microbes, so organic matter quality affects decomposition rates, and the type of it can also influence the type and diversity of the organisms present. So if we have a really diverse organic matter, both in decomposition state as well as sources, then we probably also have a much higher diversity in our biological and microbial communities. So the active portion of organic matter, carbon and nitrogen ratios, so high ratios, 10 to 20% of total organic matter, and readily accessible food for organisms. So this is our labile carbon, again the active portion, labile carbon or LOC. Management, so it can be rapidly increased by additions, but in an agricultural setting it's rapidly lost by tillage. Or passive organic matter, again described as stable or more protective, 60 to 90% of total organic matter, or TOM. So it's not readily accessible as a food source, and it contains the humic fraction, which is responsible for those cation exchange capacity and water holding properties. And if you remember what this one is called, this is our recalcitrant carbon. So at this point you might be wondering, well, if the labile carbon is a source of food for microbes, maybe that's better. But the recalcitrant carbon is responsible for our increase in cation exchange capacity and water holding properties. Maybe that's better. Which one do you want to manage for? Well, it's important to manage everything in balance, as my friend here, Thanos, would say. And so the balance between soil organic matter changes depends on gains versus losses. So we have gains of plant residue and exudates. These are applied. Losses through respiration, erosion, leaching plant material. And then the greatest effect on management. So we really want labile carbon and recalcitrant carbon on the site all the time. And the ratios of those will naturally change, but both are required for a healthy soil. So in agronomy, what does this look like? Conservation can increase our additions and decrease our losses, so just require fewer inputs from us. Additions could be crop residue, manure, cover crops. Again, if you think of our video where we have our reduced erosion, our roller crimper, leaving all of that on site is a great source of organic matter. Reduce our losses, so soil erosion, conservation tillage, no-till. Other management ideas, write down some ideas. That'd be great to hear what you think. Natural systems, so upland forests have sort of a decreased oxidation, decreased demand, decreased losses. Grasslands are pretty similar to forests. So in grasslands, we usually have this really high root turnover. And think of our mollisol soil profile, those long, deep channels of organic matter. Those are all former roots, whether they died annually or from grazing or fire. But that root turnover is driving our essential element availability. And then wetlands, so we have high production and low decomposition, so we actually have an accumulation of total organic matter and storage. Environmentally, what factors might be important? So temperature, moisture, soil texture, and soil depth all influence soil organic matter. Temperature will influence the respiration losses, so higher temperatures increase respiration and decomposition. Moisture, so soil organic carbon increases with moisture, so it's the result of increased plant growth and leaching. Think of a wetland, very wet, very high soil organic carbon. Oops, I go through too. Yeah. Texture, so differences within the landscape. Aerobic conditions, high organic matter in fine soils. Finite ability to stabilize organic matter, so there is a limit to the level of organic carbon in most soils. And then depth, carbon stocks the same amount stored per unit area of land surface. Conversion, so cropland to urban development. As a change in management, we also see a change in organic matter. So it's a very rapid decline during that initial disturbance where we're scraping off the topsoil, possibly removing it from the site, probably losing a lot through erosion. And then once the urban development is done, we see total organic matter stabilizing at a much lower volume. How do we improve it? So conservation inputs, crop residues on our agricultural sites, maintaining perennial systems, think of like forest or long-term agriculture, and then urban turf can actually improve organic matter content due to that root turnover, especially if we can increase the height of that turf and introduce other plantings within it as well. General guidelines, continuously being supplying plant residue. There's no ideal level of soil organic matter. It depends on the system and your management goals. Adequate nitrogen is needed for your organic matter levels. Think of our nitrogen deficiency period. Tillage should be eliminated or limited at best. Often results in just this flush, this loss of organic matter through an increase in decomposition. And then perennial vegetation, especially in our natural systems. Climate change, so soil's ability to store carbon, reduce CO2, biofuels, protecting our wetlands, methane production, so maybe decreasing methane production from our rice paddies, but people also still need to eat, so there's a fine balance there. And then nitrous oxide, so low oxygen conditions from manure, spreading that organic matter on the soil might be able to help reduce those nitrous off-gassing. Compost, so this is partially decomposed, stabilized organic matter. We'll talk more about compost in our amendment lectures. And our organic matter conclusion. Our organic matter conclusion. So organic matter is complex, dynamic, and very important. The active pool is the labile organic matter, or particulate organic matter. The passive pool is the humus and recalcitrant organic matter. Decomposition is driven by climate, drainage, and vegetation. And the decay and mineralization of organic matter is a major driver of elements in our soils.